Okay, so yes, without further ado, I do want to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Paul Schaffer. So Paul has a very illustrious career that you would have read about in the synopsis. He's had 18 years working in developing country issues, spanning across 50 countries. And this evening, the talk name has changed a little bit, the title, but I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Schaffer to talk about an abundance of knowledge, economic development from impoverishment lessons in Africa, Southeast Asia and Latin America. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Amy, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me. It is great to be here. It's a pleasure always to be in anything involved in EWA, and particularly the AAAA. I found it very rewarding. In preparing for what I might say this evening, I was reminded of some advice I received from the wisest person I think I've ever known, that being my father, Henry Schaffer, who would always say in his many presentations to community groups in association with farming, he would say, first, get their attention. And he would start his presentations to farming communities with a friendly insult, for which he was much loved by those audiences. And somehow the idea of starting this evening with an insult didn't seem appropriate. So instead I will begin by recounting a story from Malala Yousafzai, who, as you all know, at the age of 17, was the youngest person to have ever been awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, and quite deservedly so. The story told by Malala was of a young girl who left a refugee camp in Kenya, found her way back to her home village in Somalia, only to find herself being promptly married off. She found her way, she kicked off her marriage shoes in mid-ceremony, ran away, found her way back to Kenya, to the same refugee camp, because there was a school there. This reminded me of my own experience some 9 or 10 years ago when I was developing a joint interconnectivity strategy between India, Bangladesh, Nepal and Bhutan. And I thought it would be a good idea to visit a village or two. So a visit to a village in Noida, outside of Delhi, was arranged. Several of us arrived at this depressing site. A few scattered buildings, deep cow pads all around. And we were led to this, what was really a garden shed, like you would perhaps buy at Bunnings. And awaiting for us there was the head man of the village, the head lady, and 3 young girls. The head man fired up the little Honda generator, switched on the one operating antiquated desktop computer. And the 3 girls, who were perhaps 12 years old, were dressed in their finest attire. Heavily embroidered snow-white gowns, looking absolutely beautiful. But that was nothing compared to their behaviour when the tiny 7-inch screen was switched on to the internet. And it was an experience which just about broke my heart. The 3 girls became highly animated. Their eyes sparkled. They excited, all clustering around this tiny 7-inch screen, demonstrating their prowess at internet usage and navigating between their favourite sites. They could all read English fluently, being the language of the internet. But they spoke no English at all. the girls could all see a wondrous and exciting, colourful world outside their own drab village, but they were all acutely aware that they would never get there. Indeed, according to the head lady, one of the girls had become quite distressed by this realisation. Perhaps this is a case of what the famous Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter was referring to as creative destruction as required in the process of development. So there's no consensus on what development is, but there's enough of the agreed aspects to move forward on, such as minimum income of $1.90 per day, is the current benchmark, basic health services, infant mortality, life expectancy, and a number of other parameters. And comparisons between Southeast Asia and Africa have commonly provided a way of testing some of these theories of development. Between Southeast Asia and Africa, several case studies can be derived, and for this I've drawn heavily on the work of David Henley from Leiden University. So firstly, to Africa and Southeast Asia, then later we'll switch to a very different assessment for Latin America. Historically, both Africa and Southeast Asia were part of the fringe economy of the world, exporting forest products, and later commercial tree crops, and importing manufactures. Subsistence farming with a tribal basis for social organisation. Trade in both regions was associated with ethnic minorities. Climate and soil conditions in both regions are generally problematic for farming, and people and livestock are subject to similar health problems. Both regions have been characterised by corruption and lack of good governance and similar institutional qualities. We'll come back to that later as well. In the mid-20th century, both regions were still substantially under European rule. What happened thereafter was dramatic and led to the collapse of various theories of economic development in the late 20th century. With the divergence between Southeast Asia and Africa, the theory of an impoverished equatorial belt around the world was replaced by theories of Africa as the hopeless continent. In the early 1960s, Southeast Asians were on average much poorer than Africans. By 1980, they were on par, and by 2010, they were 2.5 times richer. Over the half century, Southeast Asia experienced almost continuous growth except for the Asian financial crisis. In Africa, per capita incomes stagnated in the 70s, declined in the 80s, and grew weakly in the 90s, and in 2010 were barely above what they were 35 years earlier. In Southeast Asia, by contrast, the spectacular growth from the 1960s was accompanied by even more spectacular reductions in poverty. In Thailand, for example, the proportion of the population living below the poverty line fell from 57% to just 24% in 18 years. In Indonesia, from 60% to 22% in 14 years, and in Vietnam, from 58% to just 19% in only 10 years. In 2005, Southeast Asian population living under $1.25 a day was 19% compared to 39% 15 years earlier. In sub-Saharan Africa, it was 51% against 58% 30 years before. The same divergence is evident in other indicators of well-being, such as infant mortality and life expectancy. All this is well known. But what is not agreed on to this day is why Southeast Asia and not Africa. And it's this question I'd like to address this evening. A comparative study shows that Africa and Southeast Asia divergence was not a statistical average of wildly different experiences. It was an extraordinarily consistent pattern in every case. For example, comparing Indonesia with Nigeria, and this has been done in a number of studies. Both of these countries experienced long periods of military rule. Both are oil rich. Both high on the corruption index. Both densely populated. But on wildly different development paths. Similarly, comparing Tanzania with Vietnam, both socialist politics, both reliant on foreign aid, and both similar on the corruption list, but again, wildly different development paths. And finally, our third comparison between Malaysia and Kenya, both capitalist, market-oriented economies, private ownership, and again, very different development paths. In every case, a persistent and dramatic divergence in development which has left Africa behind. There have been a range of hypotheses as to what was the cause of Africa's situation, including that Africa benefited less from the Green Revolution for ecological reasons. In the 1970s and 1980s, African countries had accumulated too much debt, or Africans suffered from a cumulative institutional weakness that made even good policies impossible to implement. Or alternatively, Southeast Asia had historically been more integrated into trade networks, or that many African states are too small and balkanised to benefit from scale opportunities. Industrial strategies or policies that are simply not available in Africa for cultural reasons. In Africa, there are more landlocked states, which is known to hinder development, in order of about 1% per annum. Low population density, greater ethnic diversity, etc. Many of these situations, many of these possibilities have been explored with scholarly investigation. And none of the explanations are adequate. Asia also had to overcome obstacles such as political instability, war, poor quality institutes, ethnic competition, corruption, and extreme poverty. Indonesia weathered the oil price crash of 1980s through winning the trust of the donor community, such as the IMF. But I should say that Indonesia never had any policy imposed on it by the IMF, the World Bank, or any donor country. Indonesia made it quite clear that they were in charge. And this was known at the time. It was in World Bank reports. The World Bank officers could not dictate policy to Indonesia. Indonesia was firmly in control of their own destiny, and it was recognised by all the institutions at the time. So this result, if you like, was not a result of policy dictates from the IMF or the World Bank. This was Indonesia's own policy set which dictated this progress. And in retrospect, if Indonesia had adopted the World Bank or the IMF policy set, they would not have achieved what they have achieved. And we'll come to that. In Nigeria in 1985, it rejected an IMF bailout for largely political reasons and had to turn to much more expensive commercial funds and needed to halve its capital development budget. Also, not more damaging even, Nigeria, like many countries in Africa, maintained a high exchange rate for reasons of prestige and corruption. Indonesia and Malaysia did not manipulate the exchange rate. It was always on par with what the markets expected, and there was minimal, if any, black market transactions in currency. Currency overvaluations were much more common in Kenya than Malaysia, with no significant black market. Where there was no significant black market, Malaysia indebtedness reached an extraordinary 70% of GNP. This is in Malaysia, one of our success stories. 70% of GNP, but there was no panic from the IMF or the World Bank or any other financier because they knew that Malaysia was being managed competently. And indeed, there was no savage cutbacks in Malaysia. Rather, the growth path took care of the indebtedness. Unlike in Kenya, where the growing indebtedness was such as to undermine the trust of the financiers. There's one common answer to the question of what can Africa learn from the Southeast Asian development path. And this one common answer could perhaps be summarised in 3 words, namely Export Oriented Industrialisation. And the answer is wrong. This insistence on the priority of export industrialisation reflects only a superficial or misunderstanding of history. Southeast Asia launched its economic development by doing precisely the opposite to what was then the preferred economic policies of the IMF and the World Bank and just about every orthodox economist, and including some of their own economic advisors. One of my favourite quotes, it's taken slightly out of context, but still nicely applicable. It was alarming how wrong we were and how sure we were that we were right. No manufacturing export push launched Southeast Asia on its growth path. In fact, if Southeast Asia experience is anything to go by, then African countries would do well to forget about industrialisation and focus on rural development. Precisely the opposite to what has been often dismissed as reckless. From 65 to 85, Indonesia, doing just this, ranked higher than any other Southeast Asian country except Singapore in growth per capita income by doing exactly this, focusing on the rural sector. And Indonesia's economic takeoff preceded industrial exporting by 15 years, so economic takeoff could not possibly have explained the growth. For Indonesia, the decline in poverty was from 40% down to 20% in just 8 years. In 1974, Indonesia was the largest rice importer in the world. 10 years later, in 1984, it was self-sufficient. Massive application of capital and technology into agriculture and rural infrastructure, including electrification, roads, extension services, schools, health services. So what were these policies that dictated this? What was the policy set that was independently adopted at different times, not in conference or collusion in any way. 3 particular policies were adopted by Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and some other countries there, but those were the standouts. The policy choices by each of these Southeast Asian successors substantially account for the divergence in these regions. The policy choices simultaneously in play were 1, macroeconomic stability. This is completely orthodox in economics and would have been the recommendation of the World Bank and the IMF and every other donor country. Macroeconomic stability is a reasonable policy and was in response to Indonesia's inflation of 1,000% in 1966, which brought down Sukarno and brought in Suharto. And by 1969, inflation was less than 20% and stayed there. Malaysia rarely had a problem with inflation, while Vietnam brought theirs under control from around 400% in 1986, completely different time period. And similarly, there was experience with some of the other countries, but the currency exchange was generally quite well managed in Southeast Asia. The major problem with African cases was the exchange rate, where exchange rate was kept high for political reasons, as I said, and corruption, leading to great damage to their non-oil sectors, including agriculture. And if anyone wants to see a picture of macroeconomic instability, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Here we are. And if anyone wants to know what it's like to be a trillionaire, you can see me afterwards. The second policy economic competition at the farming level. Not at the large farming level, but at the micro farming level. This was not initially adopted by Tanzania or Vietnam, who each pursued collective farms of the old Soviet style until their agricultural outputs collapsed. Africa tended to maintain powerful agricultural marketing boards that were crippling towards agriculture and deeply corrupt. Southeast Asia also had agricultural marketing boards, but these were reasonably benign, generally left the market to itself, except when prices fell very low and acted as price stabilisers. Basically, in Southeast Asia, there was open competition in production and selling of agricultural products. And the third of the 3 policies in play, and all these policies were applied simultaneously, pro-poor agricultural programs. But hang on, I thought we were talking about economic development, not welfare. How can this be? I'll come to that in a moment. All of these policies were simultaneously and aggressively implemented independently by each of the Southeast Asian successors, while this was never the case in a single country in Africa. In Southeast Asia, 1950 to 1970, the total area under technical agriculture tripled, creating a 50% increase in average rice yields. And there was a quote at the time, a very perceptive quote from Michael Lipton in 1977 in the midst of all of this. If you wish for industrialization, then prepare to develop agriculture. So what was the causality here? Why agriculture? And how can a pro-poor policy be an economic policy? Agriculture is an obvious path. It's an established industry, easy to fast track. Literally millions of farmers accustomed to working for next to nothing. Ready consumers of additional factors of production, new strains of rice, fertilisers, extension services, able to quickly incorporate these into existing production environments. No need for high-risk venture or capital or development capital or new marketing agents. Little need for new skills. Huge domestic markets and export opportunities. An immediate foreign exchange returns on at least import replacement for food. No need to pick winners. Agriculture is just a win-win-win. But the World Bank and the IMF and others were not advising in this direction. They were urban biased, as described by Michael Lipton in 1977. Fine. If we decide that agriculture is the solution, why, nevertheless, would it be a pro-poor policy? Why would we care about the very small landholders of less than 1 hectare? Why not go for Australian-style agriculture of high technology, broad-acre farming? Kenya did that and failed. Tanzania and Vietnam adopted collectivisation and brought thousands of small farms together into broad-acre farms with catastrophic consequences. And Vietnam, which had been pursuing collectivisation for 10 years, up until 1981, realised that this was a catastrophe. And from 81 to 89, undid all of that policy and handed back farms to individual private ownership, and rice production doubled. So even putting aside what might be considered as welfare objectives, pro-poor rural strategies made good economics. For a whole host of reasons, this was very much a homegrown policy and adopted despite the financiers and much of economic orthodoxy. By 1996, in Indonesia, the value of bank deposits by smallholder farmers exceeded the value of loans to small farmers by 2 to 1. The banks owed the small farmers. And small-scale farmers were supporting the corporate clients. Also, the World Bank and other analysts reported that, somewhat belatedly, that the more unequal the distribution of resources in the community, the lower the rate of economic growth. What was the implementation strategy for these policies? It's one thing to have policies, how do you implement them? This was akin to a military strategy. Scale, mass outreach, quantity, not quality, not strategy. At these times, the economic strategy and the implementation roadmaps that they were using will almost be sketched out on the back of an envelope. There were no heavy tomes of reports on how to go about economic development. It was, this is what we shall do. Back of an envelope. Urgency. Direct impact priorities, not procedures, not laws. This contrasts dramatically with South America. We'll come to that. Expediency, ends above means, results not rules. In 2012, David Cameron addressed the University of New York, perhaps with British Treasury briefing notes, and stated long-term development through aid only happens if there is stable government, lack of corruption, human rights, the rule of law, and transparency. He was wrong on every count. None of this applied in Southeast Asia. So much for the institutional model. We can talk about that a little later. Indonesia, like others, lacked transparency, was corrupt, not too particular about human rights or the rule of law, but marshalled the greatest disimpoverishment in history. Not just in terms of per capita income, but also in health services, education, and speed of implementation. How? Despite the rent-seeking elite, the lack of economic institutions, there was an underlying intent to uplift large swathes of the rural population as fast as possible, using whatever means were necessary. Partly out of self-preservation, I might add, but also partly because of the rural roots of Suharto and some of his colleagues. Similarly, Malaysia, 1959, established a Ministry of Rural Development under the Deputy Prime Minister, Abdul Razak, and it was run like a military program. And it was described as such at the time. Africa, on the other hand, pursued principles that sought to emulate wealthy countries, such as value adding, technology transfer, human capital, and it was these solutions were ill-suited to its circumstances in every way. How does this fit economic theory? Well, it does. Via the agency model, Anthony Giddens, 1976, nevertheless, some economic policy advice from reputable bodies, including the United Nations, have continued to urge development through export-oriented industrialisation up to this day, although such advice has become more muted in recent times. In summary, the great development divergence of these two regions was caused first and foremost by differences in policy choices and the intent of the governing authorities. The word being intent. They pursued outcomes that they did not need to. They could have simply revelled in the privileges of power and office. And this is an important policy conclusion in development, that it is possible to improve governance and outcomes without the far more difficult path of changing the existing social and political structures. Africa and Southeast Asia have been contrasting stories about dramatically divergent economic development from poverty. What about beyond poverty? And beyond extreme poverty, I should add. We have Latin America and the Caribbean. It's perhaps misleading to say beyond poverty. Poverty in the LAC region, Latin America and the Caribbean, is said to be around 30%. There's a different kind of measure than that in Southeast Asia. And it's not directly comparable. But we can say that beyond rural poverty, additional needs emerge involving more complex priorities. Latin America and the Caribbean provide a good test case. The context here is very different. It's a story more to do with urban poverty. In Africa and Southeast Asia, at the time of the developments we've just been speaking of, around about 70% of the population was rural. At the moment, in Latin America and the Caribbean, about 80% of the population is urban. Completely different context. Events of the 1990s in South America and public opinion gave rise to the need to strengthen governance and capacity to respond to financial crises and natural disasters. Transparency International was created in 1993, as was the World Trade Organization and the government's procurement agreement. There remained public unrest over poor governance, inability of public institutions to deliver, non-transparent public expenditures, incompetence, regressive spending priorities, and corruption. Around $1 to $1.5 trillion is lost each year to corruption in the public and private sectors worldwide. With Latin America and the Caribbean, a swathe of new regulations and legal amendments have been introduced to tighten the public sector controls over government procurement and contracting processes, and training in these controls followed. And yet low trust and disengagement have prevailed. The public avoid contact with the state and often have little trust in its competence. And you might ask, why government procurement? Government procurement is in some ways the main game. It accounts for a quarter of the economy. Here in Australia, probably more. So 1 in 4, or maybe 1 in $5 circulating is government buying something. This is the government activity most vulnerable to corruption due to its complexity, the size of the financial flows, and the close interaction between the public and the private sectors. Procurement accounts for 70% of state budgets. Government procurement and contracting is a primary mechanism for transforming financial resources of the state into community services and community outcomes. But this mechanism is weakened in the Latin America, Caribbean region by legislation and regulatory strangulation of management. A defective accountability model is also in play, and yes, also at fault is training. How can that be? Well, we'll come to that. As a major source of distrust in government and cynicism about the intent and accountability of politicians and civil servants. Quote, the government this morning has formed an anti-corruption squad to look at the conduct of the Anti-Corruption Commission, which has been overseeing the Anti-Corruption Task Force, which was earlier set to investigate the Anti-Corruption Committee. Now, that quote doesn't come from Latin America, but it comes from Africa, but it could equally apply in Latin America. And raises serious questions about the intent and accountability of government. Furthermore, the tightening of regulated controls over public sector procedures in an endeavour to eliminate corruption has achieved very little, and instead has become part of the problem. Looking at some statistics from Latin America, analysis of 10 countries in the LAC reveals no relationship at all between regulation and the corruption index. Notable is the huge volume of regulation as well as the variations between countries. For example, Panama with 500 plus contracting and procurement regulations, Bolivia, Peru, Honduras with more than 400. As could be expected, these reduce transparency, complicate the management of financial resources, and have led perversely to the creation of special purpose entities within government to circumvent the government's own regulation. It sounds bizarre, but this is the ordinary, everyday operating environment in Latin America. In Tobago, Trinidad, I think there are 50 special purpose entities that have been created in order to avoid a procurement legislation. Why not just change the legislation? A wave of new regulations have been aimed specifically at removing the element of patronage from expenditures and have no focus at all on the delivery of community outcomes. I have not seen in 50 countries any legislation, and when I speak of legislation and regulation, it's what in Australia we might refer to as policy, but in these countries it is formally legislation and regulation. In 50 countries I have never seen any regulation, legislation, which speaks of achieving the outcomes of the expenditure. Overall, the regulation of government procedures as practiced in Latin America is not capable of providing a good governance framework. Turning to training, I've said a couple of provocative things about training. Training in Latin America and Caribbean is a process of learning the regulations. It should not be mistaken for professional development. And the regulations themselves are aimed at risks of corruption rather than the achievement of community outcomes or results. It is indeed rare for procurement performance to be defined in terms of achieving the objectives of the expenditure. It is rare for the procedures to even require the objectives to be measured. And it is most unlikely that there is a causal relationship between procedural compliance and achievement of the objectives. The greatest risk is often project performance, where the project is ill-conceived, badly managed, poorly planned, rather than corruption, although corruption risks are great. It is presumed that targeting one objective, namely compliance, will deliver another objective, namely performance. There is no nexus between the two. There's no room for informed judgment. Informed judgment is explicitly disallowed. It can be a challenge to even encourage officials to simply think about alternative ways of doing things, while changing the law to allow for judgment would be considered dangerous. One government in Latin America that has partially broken from this mould has been Chile. And to quote the Brookings Institute, possibly the biggest single factor in Chile's improved public sector performance is its recognition that reform starts with a change in management focus from inputs to a focus on the achievement of results. Only Chile does this, other than one other authority in the region, the Panama Canal Authority, is also output oriented. The other 16 countries, as I've already described. To achieve this transformation requires a series of reforms to the model of accountability in Latin America. And most of these reforms need to be politically driven, although some can be driven from the bureaucracy itself. In brief, for Southeast Asia and Africa, the difference has been one of intent behind the choice of policies and policy implementation. For Latin America and the Caribbean, a good start would be simply to make program management accountable for results rather than procedural compliance. Although this would require a huge transformation in culture of government in the region, and would be subject, I suspect, to the curse of Machiavelli, that these reforms will be strongly opposed by the many losers and only receive lukewarm support from the winners. Before finishing, we can make reference to the so-called institutional model. Institutional model is somewhat reasonably modern, past 10 or 12 years. It claims to explain much of the development outcomes essentially everywhere in the world and has some reputable supporters. It proposes that development depends on economic institutions, of which there are only two types, namely extractive and inclusive. This is a different terminology from those with vested interests and those without. But on the weight of the discussion that we've just had relating to Southeast Asia and Africa and for Latin America, the supporting evidence for this model fails to account. It also is somewhat Euro, if not US-centric. And I might add that in the 1980s, Indonesia was considered to be significantly more corrupt than Nigeria in 2010. And furthermore, there are correlations between institutional qualities and economic growth, and these correlations all but disappear when the already rich countries are removed from the database. So, getting back to forgetting about the institutional model for the moment, much more important, I suggest, would be an agent model. This is partly sociological and partly economic. And under the agency model, more important than institutions are accountability and intent. And these aspects are also much more amenable to intervention. I'd like to switch quickly, since we've got a little bit of time still, to some examples of the institutional model. The best example that comes to mind is the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. This is a wonderful institution. I got to know TRAI. The short TRAI is the regulator for the telecommunications industry. And this is an institute it's an authority which is not captured by its industry. I was jealous of that. It is not asleep at the wheel. It is an aggressive, transparent entity which I think even the government of India is intimidated by. How can this be? TRAI does everything online. Everything it does is transparent. I was there when the Ministry of Communications wrote a confidential letter on paper to the regulator, to TRAI, on some obscure matter. And TRAI announced on its webpage that it had received a confidential letter from the Communications Ministry, and if it was to receive any confidential correspondence in the future, it would have no hesitation in pasting it onto its webpage. So unless you're going to be transparent, don't come to us. It was a wonderful example. Also, when I was there, they were undertaking consultation on several matters. No behind the scenes, behind the door, closed doors, consultation processes between selected representatives. They were happy to consult with 1.3 billion Indians. To do that, they ran a blog page. Anybody could enter an opinion onto the blog page. And I went through reams and reams and reams of comments by everybody who wanted to make a comment on what their opinions were. And it was really quite illuminating. There was, at the time, there was an investigation by Trade onto the Telecom's interconnect charge. This is the charge if you're on Optus and you want to call somebody who's on who's a Telstra customer. There's an interconnect charge buried in your bill. And at the time in India, that was 4 cents a call, which in price-sensitive India was enormous. Trey conducted an inquiry into this and decided that it should not be 4 cents. It should not be 0.4 cents. It should be 0.04 cents. And mandated this. Completely fearless organisation, not intimidated by its industry, was taken all the way to the High Court and prevailed. And guess what? The telcos subsequently were making more money because of the liberated the usage of mobile phones. So there was a regulator that I was very envious of. Contrast that with the TTB across the border, Bangladesh Telegraph and Telephone Board, antiquated organisation with conflicts of interest, being a provider as well as a regulator. And while I was there, there was introduction of the Village Phone Microcredit Program. And for those of you not aware of this, there was an entity by the name of Grameen Phone, which had been set up by the Norwegian Grameen Bank. And it proposed to hand out on a microcredit basis 1 mobile phone for 1 woman in each village. And I think they were handing out 39,000 phones when I was there. This was aggressively opposed by BTDB. Villages are illiterate. How can they make a phone call? And villages have nobody to call. The reality of it was that BTDB did not have a mobile phone division. The government prevailed, overrode BTDB's objections, and the statistics were extraordinary. I think when I first looked them up, there were 3 million mobile phones in Bangladesh, a country of 150 million people. There was 1 million landlines. As I was finishing my report, 4 months later in Dhaka, I thought I'd just confirm these statistics. Again, I looked them up, and the number of mobile phones, 16 million. I said, well, where's the error here? No, there's no error. That's what it was. It grew from 3 to 16 million in a matter of a couple of months. So you could say that BTDB wrote its own demise, is now, I think, been sold off. It became irrelevant after this. There's lots more to that story. Finally, I'll finish up with a story from the development of the Procurement Management Authority in Colombia, South America. The Colombian government was establishing a centralised regulator of government procurement for all the reasons of corruption and transparency and efficiency that I've spoken of. And I had been there for a couple of weeks on behalf of the World Bank, giving some advice on this. And there was a wonderful young lady in charge of this. She, very smart, a lot of energy, and connected right through to the president. And towards the end of my visit, she said, righto, tomorrow we're going to visit the office, the legal office. And she sounded hesitant about this. She said, this will be difficult. And I said, okay, well, I understood exactly what she meant. I said, is there anyone there in the legal office who is in any way progressive? And she said, yes, the director himself is good, but he's getting no support from any of his staff. Anyway, we went along, and sure enough, the first 20 minutes of the meeting, I'm listening to this all through an interpreter. The legal office explaining that what we wanted to do was not possible. It was unconstitutional, again, could not be done, impossible, and so on. So roadblocks left, right and centre, which is absolutely typical of the way business is done in Latin America. After hearing this for a bit, I interrupted and said, is it the role of the legal office to ensure that people comply with the law? Is that our final objective here? Or is our final objective for the legal office to serve the community? And the director, who had been silent up to then, punched the air and he said, yes, that's what we want. And the whole tenor of the meeting was suddenly, well, yeah, we could interpret that legislation this way, or yeah, yes, we could interpret the Constitution this way. And so suddenly everything became possible. Meaning that intent was more important than the institution. In summary, Africa and Southeast Asia, export-based development, not according to the evidence. Rural-led development paved the way to industrialization. It was a question of intent. Latin America and the Caribbean, regulated management of the state precludes professionalism. A shift from accountability for compliance to outcomes is required. It's a question of accountability. In both cases, it is possible to improve governance and policy without changing the existing social and political structures. And I've run out of time. Okay, I think I titled this talk "An Abundance of Knowledge?" ? This, of course, is an adaptation of a quote from Albert Einstein, who said, "Knowledge is in abundance. It is the ability to use it that is scarce." I think if we change the ability to use it that is scarce, maybe there's a scarcity of intent and accountability. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. Sorry to that you felt rushed then at the end. That wasn't the intent at all. But please stay up because we are going to have a few questions coming from the floor, and just wanted to thank you very much for those insights into the different economic pathways of those 3 different regions. And I'm sure that there are some questions in the room, so I'll just pass the microphone around, and if you could just introduce yourself and ask your question to Paul. Is there anyone that wants to go first? Oh, no hands. Okay, pre-prepared one from me then. Here at the Institute, we're always interested in how, I guess, these topics of international affairs affect us back here in Australia. And I'm just wondering, Paul, from all the work that you've done with the World Bank and other organisations overseas and the different learnings that you've had, what would you say back to our governments here? What are some of the learnings or things that you'd share to improve things here from an economic development perspective? I know we're talking about international economic development, but we're all concerned here at the moment with domestic economic progress as well. So it'd be great if you could just make a comment on that based on your experience overseas.
Okay. I think that if there's one standout for Australia domestically, it would be that example of the telecommunications regulator for India not being captured by the industry. I mean, it just brought back all the memories of the Banking Royal Commission and others. And how nice it would be for there to be truly independent regulators in our economy. The other couple of standouts would be that I know that Australia puts some money into the developing world, and I think there are a number of lessons in that. Also, I might just raise one other example that jumps to mind. I was doing an exercise a couple of years ago in Kazakhstan, and quite accidentally I ran into the Supreme Vice-Chancellor. In Kazakhstan they have a slightly different arrangement to Australia. They have a number of universities, all with their own Vice-Chancellors, but then there is a Supreme Vice-Chancellor who's above all of the others and who reports directly to the President. And he, without any suggestion from me, said that the President was keenly interested in the education portfolio, was handing out a significant number of fully paid scholarships for his best students to go anywhere in the world. Did I have any networks into Australia? And I said, oh, you don't. I think I could refer you to the University of Western Australia. I gave him the contact. And subsequently myself called up the appropriate individual somewhere in the Vice-Chancellor's office, I'm not sure who it was now, and said, look, you might expect a call from Kazakhstan who are interested in networking with Australia. And I could not have found a more disinterested person anywhere on the planet. I think they were organising their visit to London or something or other. It was soul-destroying. And it's not as if that Kazakhstan is a bad target. Some of the US universities, including Carnegie Mellon, have already got a campus in Kazakhstan. So that was a missed opportunity, and there was another such missed opportunity in India, which I thought I could line up with Curtin University. So there are lessons internationally, for sure.
I'd like to know how it is you maintain any enthusiasm for working in this field. It sounds very unrewarding.
There's much of it which is very rewarding. Yes, quite a number of times projects fail. You have to be philosophical about that. But many times projects succeed, even when you've forgotten about them. I remember giving advice to the Bangladesh government about the legal format or the law for e-government, e-commerce, the electronic environment. And I gave a whole lot of advice on that because I sensed at the time they were heading exactly down the wrong path, down the mistaken path that had been followed by many other countries. And anyway, I gave them the advice and thought nothing of it. Okay. Anyway, I ran into the relevant official from the Prime Minister's office some months later, 6 months later, and he reminded me. He said, that advice you gave us on the legislation. I said, yeah. He said, we've done that. We've done it exactly the way you said it. Oh, okay. So you can make an impact. Similarly with the introduction of e-government in Nepal. We developed a program there of 18 sub-programs. And years later I heard that they were in fact in the middle of implementing all of that program. That was a very good program. It was very rewarding. Many other times, such as my recent visit to Kurdistan, they again were interested in doing things, but I think did not have the human capacity to do what was required. So all you can do is do what you can and hope for the best, and sometimes it works. Yeah.
Just can I put another one in? How do you imagine dealing with the stress of the immigration pressure that seems to be coming from all around the world? I mean, look at Maduro. What can anybody do?
Well, the easy answer to that is, it's not my field. No, I don't know. I don't have any answers.
Just picking up on that comment that you made about human capacity, and you mentioned through your speech about, talking about intent and accountability, and from those, they're vastly different regions, and just wondering, for economic development, how much does the traditions or the culture play into it from what you've seen as well, in terms of helping that process along?
Yes, culture is a huge thing. Culture has been attributed to being one of the main causes why Africa is so far behind. But on the other hand, cultures do change, and they can be helped to change if it's done in a way which is sensitive to what their expectations are. The experience I set out for the legal office in Colombia was a bureaucratic culture, if you like. It's changed in an instant. And the culture of communities themselves, such as shifting from, in Indonesia's case, rural backwardness to hugely advanced rural economy in a matter of a decade, must have involved culture change in the community, but in a way which is not threatening to them. It can be done. Yeah.
In your experience, Paul, in terms of the difference between Southeast Asia and Africa, is tribalism a big issue given the way Africa is carved up by the European powers versus the way Asia developed? And I've been to Africa and I've seen some of the the problems with the differences between different tribes and so forth, and trying to develop the given concept of nation state?
Sure. It's a factor, but it doesn't explain the difference between the two regions. Indonesia, they speak more than 500 languages. The single most successful African state from a culturally unified perspective is Ethiopia. But from a development perspective, a complete disaster. Completely and utterly failed. On the other hand, in Southeast Asia, Malaysia was assembled from just a collection of 8 or 9 sultanates across a loose connection of a loose association of around 12 or 13 regions, and has been hugely successful. So I don't believe that as you say, the tribalism is a determining factor by any means.
Would you like to comment on the description by the World Bank and IMF and others during the global financial crisis as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, the Africa region? And what are your views on the classical kind of descriptions as far as the crisis is concerned?
I think that if we just go back a few years before the global financial crisis, towards the end of last century, there was what was called the Washington Consensus. This was between the IMF, the US government, the World Bank and others as to the way forward, which was to require, as a condition of support, that countries comply with balanced budgets, properly managed currencies, get government out of business, that's privatisation, stable currency and so on, all macroeconomic and privatisation, very much US and European-centric interpretation of the world. This was imposed for a few years and was quite catastrophic. It was a disaster. And all of those institutions backed out of this, except in the IMF to some extent, backed out of that formula and became much less prescriptive after that time. I think in the global financial crisis, one of the key targets then was Latin America, which had huge debts, and there was really the debt crisis, which is governing the situation even today. Those institutions have become less prescriptive, but again, still essentially orthodox economics. And my interpretation of this is I would rather see the homegrown solutions like Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam and others to whatever fits. But it can't be all one way. Those countries must keep the confidence of the financiers, as Indonesia did. Indonesia did not accept any policy imposed upon it by anybody, but had under it some good economic advisors, most of them local people that had been educated in the US and in Holland. And they were able to talk to the World Bank and the IMF and others in a way which convinced those authorities that these guys knew what they were doing, even though what they were doing was completely the opposite of orthodox economic policy. So there's a need for these countries to work on credibility. I think there's room within the World Bank to accept alternative models, provided that there's a credible rationale around it.